All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get started since it's exactly 2 o'clock and we have quite a few things to cover today. I'd want to thank all of you for joining us on today's webinar, Emergency Rental Assistance Programs, Looking Back and Moving Forward. I'm Andrew Arn, the Vice President for Research at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and I'm really happy that all of you could join us this afternoon. As many of you know, millions of renters are struggling to pay their bills. About 1 in 5 renters today is behind on paying their rent. More than a third have little or no confidence that they can pay their rent on time next month. And among low-income renters, it's even worse. About 45% of low-income renters have no confidence or little confidence that they can pay their bills next month. Fortunately, what we've seen in the last 9 months is state and local jurisdictions have created or expanded hundreds of emergency rental assistance programs around the country in response to the pandemic. And if we can go to the next slide, as of today, we're aware of about 575 programs across 46 states, the District of Columbia, and 397 local jurisdictions. And these programs represent at least $4.5 billion in funding that jurisdictions have devoted to emergency rental assistance. Most of that funding, about 70% of it, comes from the CARES Act. You can find contact information for these programs through our website. You'll see the link down at the bottom of the screen. And then you can also go further into a more detailed database that we maintain, where you can see other characteristics of these programs, like eligibility criteria, documentation requirements, levels of assistance that these programs provide. And it's based on information from our state partners and many other contacts, as well as the news and other media sources. And I'll mention also that we continue to track these programs, and we typically update this database every week. So if you know of an area that has a program and you don't see it on the map, or you don't see it in our database, by all means, you can email us and let us know. And the email is pretty easy to remember. It's research@nlihc.org. The funds that we committed last year to emergency rental assistance were really important, but as we all know, it wasn't enough. And given how many renters need assistance and how long the pandemic has continued. The recent COVID-19 relief package that was enacted in the end of December, of course, included $25 billion in emergency rental assistance. Sorry. That will be allocated to states and jurisdictions, some local jurisdictions. And that's thanks in large part to the thousands of housing advocates and people in the housing field who really pushed for that rental relief. So this is a key moment for us. We have an opportunity to learn from these state and local programs that were created or expanded last year. By taking a close look at these programs, we can learn from them about what works to get much needed relief to renters, and to learn what program features create barriers to renters receiving relief in some cases. So, and I will mention that, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, more in the report, more in the webinar, but a positive development over the last few months is that we have seen jurisdictions, that faced initial challenges in implementing their rental assistance programs. What we've seen over the last couple of months is they have really learned how to do this, and they have been able to get money out. And those programs can share their knowledge with other jurisdictions who are now just starting to do that. And so that leads us to our webinar today. And NLIHC, the Housing Initiative at Penn, and the NYU's Furman Center released results today and lessons learned from a survey that we conducted of more than 200 of these emergency rental assistance programs. We released those findings today, and we'll share a link with you to that report later on. And our guest speakers are going to talk about those results, and about additional research that we've undertaken, all with the goal of using what we learn to ensure that the newest round of federal emergency rental assistance funding is spent well and spent in a timely manner, because renters really do need the assistance as soon as possible. And our speakers today are going to be Rebecca Ye, who is NLIHC Senior Research Analyst, Claudia Aiken, who is Director of the Housing Initiative at Penn, and Vincent Reyna, who is Faculty Director of the Housing Initiative at Penn. And I do just want to mention, I want to thank Claudia and Vincent for participating in this collaboration with us, as well as also want to thank Ingrid Gold-Ellen and Tyler Hopper from the NYU Furman Center, who are also very integral to this research, but they couldn't make it or be on the panel this afternoon. And we will have additional research coming out in the future as we continue to learn about these programs. And then the agenda today is we're going to first talk about the latest research on emergency rental assistance. We're going to talk about our national survey of programs that we discussed, that we released today, as well as additional research that Penn has done on understanding the landlord side of things, understanding landlord behavior and their thinking. And then that will lead us talking to some best practices or some recommendations for the money that will be rolled out through the Treasury's emergency rental assistance, which was part of the COVID relief package. And then we will have time for a Q&A. Before we get started though, I do want to mention just a couple of housekeeping things. Attendees today are on mute, but you are all welcome to enter questions either in the chat box or in the question box that you see at the bottom of your screen. And during the question and answer session, we will draw questions from both the chat box and the question and answer box. I'm fairly sure, just based on past experience, we won't have time to, of course, get to everyone's question. But I just want to mention that even if we don't get to your question, it is still important. And we not only record the webinar, but we also record the transcripts of the chats as well as the Q&A. And it is those questions that really help point us to what are the questions we should be answering in further research. And so again, I just want to thank all of you for being here. And I think with that, I will turn it over to Claudia from the Housing Initiative at Penn.
Thanks, Andrew. And we're so pleased to be working with the coalition on this. As Andrew said, I'm going to spend some time talking about the survey of over 200 programs that we jointly conducted with the coalition and with NYU Furman Center. And I'm just going to highlight some points. We expand on them, of course, in the brief. I want this to just be a jumping off point for your questions and your comments. What we're really hoping for these data is that they'll be useful to states and localities that are now working on a new round of rental assistance thanks to the recent relief package. So to start off, a little more info on the survey itself. Those of you attending this webinar who may have completed our survey know that it was pretty intense. We asked program administrators from across the country to answer over 50 questions about their programs. Of those who responded, 22 were statewide programs, 80 were city level, 70 were county level, and 48 were regional programs, meaning that they served multiple cities or counties. Understandably, not all respondents answered every single question in the survey, so our results for any given point are just based on the subset who did answer that question. And the original survey was conducted over the course of August through October of 2020. We know that a lot of programs were actually just getting started in the late summer and in the fall. So we did go back and ask for updates on some of the implementation statistics in December and January. Next slide, please. So what did we learn about rental assistance programs? Next slide. Most of the programs we surveyed, as I said, launched in the late spring and summer of 2020. As such, most of them relied on some form of CARES Act funding, whether that be CDBG-CV, CRF, or another stream of funding. Next slide. Not all of these programs were brand new, though. About a quarter were expansions or modifications of programs that existed in some form before the pandemic. But interestingly, the high share of new programs was consistent over time, meaning that many new programs were actually being launched really early on. Next slide. We asked programs to list their goals. Two of the most commonly cited were stemming evictions and preventing homelessness. But most programs had 3 or more goals, which is just an indication of the complexity and the high level of need for these programs. Next. Because CARES Act funding flowed through government agencies, for the most part, those agencies were the ones to implement the programs. However, a significant share were implemented by nonprofits as well. Next. Further, many programs partnered with nonprofits to review and select applicants, likely because they needed that additional capacity or because local nonprofits already had experience in this area and they were trusted in target communities. The amount of the subsidy available to applicants varied widely across programs. The median was $1,200 per household per month, and over 60% of programs were providing that assistance for 1 to 3 months, whereas around 30% provided that support for 6 to 12 months. And interestingly, programs that offered the assistance for a longer period of time also tended to offer a higher monthly subsidy. The vast majority of programs in our survey asked tenants to complete the initial application, but the majority also then ultimately provided the subsidy to the landlords, not the tenants, as this was required by some funding streams. This set up kind of an interesting point where applicants had been found to be eligible to participate, but then their landlords still had to agree to participate. Tenant eligibility criteria, going back to the previous slide. The two most common eligibility criteria were a cap on tenant incomes and a COVID-19 related hardship. But most jurisdictions actually applied 3 or more criteria. And some of these were explicitly required by funding sources, but others were due to cautious interpretations of funding rules because jurisdictions were concerned about audits and reporting. Next. Some programs then gave additional priority to certain groups beyond, determining eligibility. And the most common of these priority groups was very low income households. Priority was given in various ways, such as fast tracking certain applicants or giving them more weight in a lottery for assistance. Next. The two most commonly requested items in the application were documentation of income and a current lease. The majority of programs required proof of COVID-19 related income losses, while some actually allowed applicants to self-certify their income loss instead. Programs were divided in terms of the level of information needed for personal identification, with 60% requiring just a driver's license or some form of state ID, but 40% asking for a social security number. Next. Finally, nearly all of the programs in our sample placed at least one restriction on landlords, and over half placed more than one requirement. The most common of these was a commitment not to evict the participating tenant, usually for 1 to 2 months, but sometimes for a longer period. Additional landlord requirements included things like forgiveness of the tenant's arrears, a current rental license, participation in the local rent registry, and a commitment not to increase rent for a certain period. Next. We also asked program administrators about the key limitations that their programs faced. Next. Almost half of program administrators said their programs faced 4 or more key limitations, and more than 2/3 listed at least 3. The two most common were related to the completeness of applications and to staff capacity. This is not surprising, given the huge challenges around navigating an application process during a public health crisis. And in addition, a lack of pre-existing internal capacity and infrastructure for the development and delivery of rental assistance likely contributed to some of the capacity issues that programs cited. A final constraint worth noting here is that of landlord cooperation. Since, as I said, the vast majority of rental assistance programs required landlord engagement, if a landlord couldn't be contacted or refused to participate, their tenant would be unable to access assistance. And the fact that nearly 50% of programs cited landlord cooperation as an issue highlights that this was an important barrier. And my colleague Vincent is going to talk a little bit more about that later. Next. All right. So this survey didn't tell us anything about how the assistance impacts tenants or landlords, but it does tell us a few important things about how programs fared in terms of reaching applicants and making sure that eligible applicants were assisted. Next. So the volume of applications is important because it does reflect in part how well a program was advertised and how easy it was to apply. Although of course it's also a reflection of things like the demand, the need for rental assistance. So we found that even early on, demand met or exceeded expectations for most programs. For some, demand was even orders of magnitude greater than expected or than programs were able to meet. It is worth noting, however, that about a quarter of programs reported that tenant response was less than anticipated. However, we also found that the volume of applications increased over time. Next. Another outcome measure we use in our brief is the ratio of households actually served to the number of program expected to serve. And this can be thought of as the ability to get money out the door to actually distribute funds. A slight majority of programs served fewer households than expected as of our initial survey in August through October, but that average ratio had increased by December and January. Many programs still had not served the number of households they expected to serve at that point, so that does reflect real challenges in distributing funds within a very limited period of time. Next. All right, finally, I want to talk about how these outcome measures connect to specific program characteristics, what works and what doesn't. So in our sample, about 40% of programs used HUD CARES Act, like CDBG CV. Another 40% used coronavirus relief fund money from the Treasury and no HUD funds. Finally, about 20% used only other sources, things like local funds and philanthropic dollars. Next. We find that more restrictive sources, like CDBG CV, were associated with a lower ratio of actual to expected households served. And this makes sense, in part because we also see that programs using that more restrictive funding had more stringent criteria for tenants. Next. We found that statewide programs were initially better able to get money out the door, but local and regional programs had caught up by the end of the year. Next. New programs that launched in response to COVID-19 started off with smaller staffs, fewer outreach methods, and more stringent requirements than programs that had existed already before the pandemic. Their outcome measures improved over time, however, and by the end of the year, they had also caught up in terms of getting money out the door. And finally, programs that partnered with nonprofits reported fewer capacity limitations and were ultimately better able to get money out the door than other programs. Next. We found that indeed programs that had more numerous and more stringent landlord requirements were less able to get money out the door. In particular, requiring landlords not to evict participating tenants for longer periods of time was correlated with a lower ratio of expected households served. And interestingly, programs serving larger localities were more likely to report limitations of landlord cooperation. With respect to tenants, we did not actually find any correlation between the number and stringency of tenant eligibility criteria or application requirements and the ratio of actual to expected households served. But some requirements, such as requiring proof of COVID-19 related income losses, were individually associated with greater difficulty distributing funds and issues of application completeness. Also of interest was that targeting rental assistance to lower income households, i.e. setting a lower AMI threshold, was associated with getting more money out the door. We very much plan to continue studying rental assistance programs. Next. For starters, we are currently conducting interviews with a subset of administrators whose programs represent a broad cross-set of jurisdictions and program types. We're also engaging with municipalities on how our findings can inform program design and development, especially as they're moving to distribute the new round of relief. And lastly, we're hoping to resurvey programs on an ongoing basis in order to better understand the evolution of rental assistance and related programs. On that note, I want to offer our heartfelt thanks to everyone who went to the trouble of filling out our survey or letting us interview you. You are doing amazing work, and we're so grateful to be able to learn from you. And if you've not yet engaged with us and would like to, please get in touch. You can either let the coalition know or shoot HIP an email at housinginitiative@design.upenn.edu. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to my colleague, Vincent.
Cool. Thank you, Claudia. And thank you all for being here today and for all of the work that you all are doing. So what I'm going to do is present some ongoing work that we're doing around surveying owners and tenants in the space. And so if we can go to the next slide. So at the Housing Initiative at Penn, we're doing several things. We've been working directly with municipalities to help them design and evaluate rent relief programs. We're not a fee-for-service organization. We're an academic organization that serves as an academic partner, just providing this guidance and research support. We're conducting ongoing surveys of tenants to create a longitudinal panel of households that do and don't receive rental assistance, to essentially follow these households over time, to track their needs from the baseline throughout the receipt of subsidy and the lack of receipt of the subsidy, and try to estimate the impact of this assistance on a broad set of outcomes. Thus far, we've conducted 2 rounds of surveys in all 5 of our partner sites and have a fairly large response rate with thousands of surveys in each of those sites. And today I'm going to share some preliminary findings from some of the stuff we're seeing. We've also deployed a landlord survey in Philadelphia and the city of Los Angeles. We've analyzed the Philly one. We're in the process of analyzing the Los Angeles one. And we're in the process right now in the next couple of weeks of deploying the similar owner survey out across the remainder of our sites. You can go to the next slide. So today what I'm going to do is focus in on Philadelphia's SARA program, which was their rent relief program, and particularly the landlord survey associated with that. So 8,900 tenants applied to the SARA program and over 4,000 ultimately received the assistance. One thing that became clear early in the program is that many eligible applicants were unable to benefit because their landlord chose not to participate in the program. And by not participating, that comes in 2 forms. It either comes in a lack of response to the city, or it comes in an actual formal acknowledgement that they don't want to actually participate in the program. This is important to acknowledge because, like Claudia mentioned, a large share of programs had the subsidy flow through the landlord themselves, even when the tenant was applying. So that means in this scenario, the tenant is unable to receive the assistance if the landlord refuses to engage in the program. This raises an interesting question, an important question of why would landlords engage or not engage in these programs, but more importantly needs to be rooted in a much broader understanding of what is going on in the lower cost housing stock portfolio across multiple cities, what challenges existed prior to COVID, how are they potentially exacerbated during the current pandemic, and then how does that interact with rental assistance, right? If we can go to the next slide. So one of the things we did is we launched a survey of landlords in Philadelphia. We had, through partnerships with the city, we were able to reach out to all landlords of properties where a tenant applied for rental assistance. We partnered with the Reinvestment Fund on a report that we released in December. The Reinvestment Fund conducted a series of extensive interviews with stakeholders throughout the city, landlords, lawyers, government officials, and combined, we presented a report providing an overview of the landlord perspective in Philadelphia. I will say the findings I present here today are a product of that report, but also a report we did separately on our own, just based on our survey results. If we can go to the next slide. So we released the survey in September 2020, and we received over 600 landlord responses. And through this also actually engaged landlords a lot through kind of email responses as well. So was able to kind of learn some anecdotal experiences as well. So a couple basic demographics, 43% of respondents were small landlords with 1 to 5 units, 16% owned 30 plus units. Larger landlords were generally more experienced, it seems, on several fronts. This generally fits the profile of the Philadelphia housing stock, and particularly the units that tend to be lower cost housing units. If we go to the next slide. So one thing that's clear in our survey is that there were many challenges prior to COVID, right? Many owners were experiencing difficulties in their rental business prior to the pandemic. Over a quarter indicated having difficulties with the tenant non-payment before March 1st, 2020. We can go to the next slide. These constraints became all the more severe with the onset of COVID-19. So we asked about a host of constraints, and pretty much across the board, every one of them gotten worse. Reported difficulty paying rent, paying the mortgage increased by 68%, right? Next slide. So we understand the context of the fact that owners prior to the pandemic were facing challenges, and we outlined those in more detail in our reports. It only got worse during the pandemic itself. And so what we wanted to do is understand owners' perceptions of rent relief programs, whether they engaged in it, and why they may or may not have. Well over half of owners in our survey found it, so we asked them a series of questions about reasonableness, about parameters of rent relief programs generally, and also specific variations of the Philadelphia program. I will say that Philadelphia had multiple rounds of rent relief. They first had the SARA program, then there was a state program, then there was another round. And what they did actually at the end is they converted a pool of applicants from their second round where the owner did not engage to a direct to tenant form of assistance. So when we asked the question about the parameters of the reasonableness of the parameters of these rent relief programs, we saw that well over half of owners found it somewhat unreasonable, not unseasonable, but I guess those are both the same things, or unreasonable or totally unreasonable to accept $750 for the full rent of a unit or forgive back rent, right? So $750 was the amount of one of the subsidy programs that the second round, the state program in Pennsylvania. So we use that number, but what's interesting is it's also not just that dollar amount, but also about forgiveness of back rent. Waiving late fees and entering repayment agreements was perceived as a more reasonable option. And our survey data suggests that a lot of owners were actually doing this prior to the pandemic and even in the early phases of the pandemic, right? Regardless of rent relief. If you can go to the next slide. We asked a lot of questions about owner characteristics, particularly owner size. And what we found were that large owners, meaning owners of more units, were less likely to participate in the SARA program and the rent relief program generally, right? Although this lack of a participation, clearly you can see is prevalent across all kind of owner sizes, but particularly most prevalent among large owners. Next. What we found was that larger landlords were less likely to report that they had been somewhat or very much impacted by COVID-19. Landlords less impacted by COVID-19 in general were less likely to participate in rent relief programs. And we also found that larger landlords were less likely to view requirements to suspend evictions and forgive arrears as reasonable. Generally, smaller landlords were more likely to be impacted, more likely to engage in the program, and more likely to see concessions as reasonable, and also more likely to actually be engaged in some of those concessions prior to the actual pandemic, but also throughout the pandemic and regardless of the rent relief program itself. We can go to the next slide. So in looking at Philadelphia, next slide, we found that rental property owners, particularly those with small portfolios, face longstanding financial challenges, which have been compounded due to COVID-19. The majority of owners are willing to engage in rental assistance programs, but a one-size-fits-all model could discourage some. Particularly a small share of landlords have no desire to engage in these programs, be it due to structural aspects of the program or just a lack of desire to engage in government programs more generally. And it's important to acknowledge this reality and build a safety net for tenants who need relief but cannot access it. It's completely unfair that if a tenant is applying for housing assistance and qualifies, that they should be prohibited from accessing that benefit because of an owner's lack of desire to engage in the rental assistance program. So I want to preview some other findings now, because clearly this is just Philadelphia, and we are looking at Los Angeles and other sites, right? In Los Angeles, we found thus far that over 3/4 of owners say they've been impacted by COVID-19, with well over half being very impacted, right? The majority are landlords have no previous engagement with local or national rental assistance or loan programs. And this was actually true in Philadelphia as well. What's really interesting is that these are largely a portfolio of owners who have not prior be involved in any kind of federal subsidy programs, particularly the Section 8 voucher program or even local programs. Tenant non-payment and difficulty filling vacancies has increased significantly across Los Angeles landlords since the pandemic. There's an increase in landlords saying they have difficulty paying their mortgage, taxes, and utilities. The two restrictions of the greatest concern for landlords are eviction restrictions and limitations on rent increases. So the eviction one is a common thread that comes out across the multiple sites. And the largest group of landlords who responded were those with fewer than 5 units. If we go to the next slide. And I guess actually to speak to that previous slide, similar to Philadelphia, what we're finding is that the variation between small and large landlords persists. So what we've done as well is we've engaged in multiple rounds of surveys of households who applied for rental assistance. Some of them received assistance, some of them have not received assistance. Those have not received assistance might have not received it because either they didn't necessarily qualify through the application round, couldn't make it through the application process, their owner didn't agree to participate in the program, or because there was a wait list and they didn't actually get served by a function of the demand for the subsidy exceeding the current supply. We're finding some initial results, right? And we're previewing some here, but we have a lot more to share. The survey, similar to the other surveys we're doing, is very robust. We're asking a whole bunch of employment, childcare, education, health, stress, and housing related questions of these households and tracking them over time. But I wanted to share some key themes that are emerging already. So as we would expect, our survey confirms, right? There's pre-existing challenges of housing affordability and precarity. That's no surprise to anyone on this call, and very well documented. We had a long-standing and persistent housing affordability crisis prior to the pandemic, right? What's interesting is that our survey seems to suggest that since the pandemic, there are no signs of significant increases in people moving, or at least since the start of rent relief programs. But there's a lot of caveats to that reality. And by move, we mean a move by choice, a move by force, or perceived force, right? And so we ask a whole bunch of questions about, have you been evicted? Has your owner threatened eviction? Various questions along those lines to kind of unpack whether or why a household will move. But we all know that there, aside from the CDC eviction moratoria, there are a whole host of local eviction moratoria. There are also a host of eviction diversion programs. And on top of that, we already know that there was a high level of moving and housing precarity prior to the pandemic, right? And so this fact on its own is in some ways kind of affected clearly by a whole host of factors. What we're finding though is that the vast majority of households are either unemployed or have experienced a loss of income. Again, that's not surprising based on all we know. There are different levels of household needs, and this is particularly striking. There are some households facing extremely high levels of rent owed, right? And there are some households with with relatively lower levels. And so what it seems to be is that currently there's, at least in the sites that we're surveying, kind of large variation in tenant needs, right? With some with insurmountable housing related debt right now, right? Or rent owed right now. And others that are small, and that could be because it's recent, or it could be longstanding or other factors, and we're unpacking that a bit more. Another reality is that across the board, tenants are facing increased levels of debt. So even in the case of people with small levels of rent owed, we're seeing high levels of overall debt. We're seeing people increasingly rely on family members, on credit cards, on payday loans, on informal forms of lending, on formal forms of lending to essentially pay their housing costs, right? And so there's a reality that there is rent owed, and for some, it's a very large amount. But for everyone we're surveying, there's significant increases in overall debt owed. And that's not necessarily formalizing in rent owed because people are relying on other forms of capital, credit, savings, resources to essentially extend themselves as far as they can to actually pay their rent. We can go to the next slide. Next slide. So we're going to be conducting ongoing surveys with tenants and landlords in our partner cities. For the landlords that we've surveyed already, we're going to be releasing follow-up surveys to kind of look at change over time of some of these dynamics. For the residents that we're surveying, we have cohorts of households that we plan to follow over time. We're collaborating with other research organizations to develop more nuanced findings, right? We're in the process of merging our survey data with more larger and robust administrative data on exposure to homeless services and larger exposure to kind of other public programs and forms of public assistance. And then we're looking to more actively link these survey-based outcomes clearly to variation in program design and structure to look at the effect of that on some of these households. So a lot more to come on all of those fronts, but we're happy to engage you all in this and would welcome any and all feedback. And I guess on the last slide, we of course thank our funders for this throughout doing all the survey work, particularly of residents. We're using gift cards to reimburse people for their participation. And we're very grateful to the Stoneleigh Foundation, the Annie Casey Foundation for supporting those efforts across multiple of our sites. And clearly, though, our findings and our work here reflect our findings and perspectives, not those of the foundations.
So I think that the big question here is, well, how do we move forward with the $25 billion in the Treasury Emergency Rental Assistance Program? What are some of the best practices? A couple of weeks ago, NLHC, the National Income Housing Coalition, released a report on best practices that state and local emergency rental assistance programs can use to think through different moving parts. And this report is informed by research we've been conducting, as well as insights shared by state and local advocates during our state and local implementation working group calls hosted every Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern time. So I'm linking the report in the chat box in case you haven't seen it yet. This report is very much a living document, and we'll be continually updating it as state and local advocates and researchers continue to find new best practices. And this guidance, this report seeks to address both broad steps to implementing an emergency rental assistance program and frequently asked questions that dig a little bit deeper into implementation. So if you go to the next slide, I'll really briefly cover a few best practices that are especially relevant given the latest research. So first, emergency rental assistance programs should keep their applications short, simple, and require basic eligibility information, and not ask for excessive documentation. Simple documentation requirements can increase accessibility for tenants, reduce administrative burden, and potentially increase the speed at which funding is distributed. And the law enacting the Treasury Emergency Rental Assistance Program suggests that applicants can attest to economic hardship in writing, and administrators should really consider using this option. Second, a significant share of emergency rental assistance should be targeted to households with the lowest incomes. These renters typically have the fewest financial supports to fall back on and are most at risk of eviction and homelessness. The survey research also suggests that programs targeting households with lower incomes tended to be more effective at distributing assistance than programs targeting households with moderate incomes. Third, program administrators and programs in general will need to be judicious with landlord concessions. A lot of programs in the past year have placed additional requirements on landlords, usually in an effort to stretch the limited supply of emergency rental assistance, as well as to ensure its effectiveness in maintaining housing stability and have tenant protections. But the research has found that programs with overly stringent concessions have tended to be less successful, and sorry. And I do want to note that these programs are mostly using tenant-based applications as a kind of a caveat to the research. But overall, overly stringent concessions may be reducing landlords' willingness to participate, so program administrators will need to be judicious. And then lastly, it's critical that programs work with organizations embedded in communities hardest hit by housing instability and COVID-19, especially organizations serving communities of color and other organizations with experience in providing aid and support to people in need, like community action agencies, United Way, and 211. These organizations can bolster outreach efforts. They're already embedded in the community, hold the community's trust, and they can also help with intake efforts. Jurisdictions that leveraged local networks were particularly effective at getting funds to renters in need from the research. And I will stop here in terms of best practices. Feel free to take a look at the report. I also wanted to address briefly that the US Treasury Department has released some brief guidance. They released an FAQ on how jurisdictions can use the Treasury Emergency Rental Assistance funding. There are many problematic items in the FAQ that run counter to what's effective and that are overly restrictive. So NLHC is urging Secretary Yellen and the US Treasury Department to retract the FAQ that Treasury posted. In particular, I'll just note two things that we're noticing. We're advocating that Treasury should allow for self-attestation to show income to be adequate in itself, as the language of the law suggests. Right now, the FAQ is asking for source of income documentation, and this would be really critical to effectively and efficiently distribute aid to renters most in need of assistance. Another thing is that Treasury is also requiring programs to solicit participation from landlords for 21 calendar days before programs can use the direct to tenant option. And we just think that this timeframe is too long, so we're advocating for shortening that. We're running out of time, so I'll post a link on the letter that we sent, and you can see a number of the issues with that FAQ. I'll also post the Treasury FAQ and hand it back to Andrew.
Oh, thanks. And there's a lot more information I feel like we could go over, but limited time. So I've been trying, or I should say we, because not just me, we've been trying to organize and track the questions people have been asking. And so I have a few written down here. Again, we're not going to have time to get to all of them, but for those we don't get to, we will respond to some of them ourselves to you afterwards. And then also, again, all these questions really help us think about what we need to be looking more deeply into. The first question I'm going to ask, I'm asking because we've gotten it from a number of people, and that is the finding that programs that had lower income targeting, so lower income thresholds, seem to get the money out better, or more of their money out. And a number of people have asked why you think that is. And I'll just clarify, I realize that, that's not a question we asked the programs, because that, we just found that finding from our survey, but I guess I'm wondering if anyone on the panel has some expectations about why that might be.
I mean, there's a host of factors that could affect that. So one is that, being explicit about that upfront could create some kind of selection bias, and then who applies and maybe who's able to more actively get through the application process, right? Because they could actually kind of know the criteria and make sure that they meet it before they're applying. Another reality is that these programs function within systems of dramatic outreach, right? And some municipalities were very actively doing targeted outreach. And I'd venture to say, and I don't know this for sure, though, that places that targeted lower income households were very strategic and targeted in getting to those communities where lowest income households live, and partnering with nonprofits that particularly work with that kind of constituency base. That said, generally, right, there is a reality that the lowest income households were also more generally likely to apply across, whether that was a restriction or not, right? So they were a larger share of the pool likely across all of these sites. So that's kind of an existing context that existed regardless of that criteria.
I would just add to that. Again, I'm not sure if this is the case, but possibly programs that were structured to reach lower income households imposed landlord requirements in line with that targeting, whereas programs that were also meant to reach moderate income households maybe imposed requirements that landlords with higher rents didn't find acceptable.
And then another question that has been asked at least twice here is, you're all familiar with a lot of programs across the country. And could you provide suggestions for how to ensure that the highest need, most at-risk households know about emergency rental assistance and are able to apply and receive assistance? And before you answer, I'm going to give a little context here, because the same person also then commented on hearing that first come, first served programs could cause fair housing issues. And so I think the questioner is really asking in the context of distribution methods, but the broader question is, how can programs, ensure that those with the highest need are able to apply and get assistance?
Well, with regard to the distribution methods, I think we did find that a first come, first serve approach can create issues because it sets up a dynamic where those who are most connected to these programs are the first to apply and possibly the first to qualify just because they're in that network, that they're in the know, whereas communities that are more disconnected never have the chance, say, to get the internet connection or see the person that they need in order to apply for assistance. So instead, having an application window and then using a lottery that potentially more heavily weights groups that face more barriers, including things like language barriers, high poverty concentration, et cetera, can be effective, I think, in reaching those groups that most need this assistance.
Yeah, and I would say that, one of our key findings from the report, right, is that partnerships with nonprofits really was correlated with getting more dollars out the door, right? And that's key for kind of assistance with outreach, assistance with process, all of those kinds of things, right? I will say anecdotally, we also know that there were kind of innovative approaches that municipalities use to also get word out, right? So I know that in Philadelphia, in Orange County, North Carolina, in other places, they had librarians where libraries were closed, essentially working the help desk line, right? To bring in as much capacity as possible. In LA County, they leveraged the resources of 211 to essentially help with both allowing people without internet access to be able to call in and fill out applications and things along those lines. So people really thought creatively about capacity and partnerships. And I would say the last thing is, the use of data. And so we saw a lot of municipalities very actively tracking number of applications that they were getting and also where they were getting from. So in one of our partnerships, actually, we worked with one city partner where we did a lot of kind of daily analysis for them to help them understand where some places they were seeing under applications. And what that did is it allowed them to maybe do a more active push in those areas where there were fewer applications than they would expect. And so there was a real opportunity here to use data proactively. And I feel like the programs that saw that, used that, and thought in innovative ways about that were really helpful. And I would say the last bit here is, we referenced the direct to tenant option before. And I do think that municipalities that thought about the whole life cycle and ensuring that, not only do people apply and get through it, but that they receive the assistance, and reacted to that and thought about ways to plug the gap for folks who did qualify, but were still not receiving assistance by converting some of their more flexible funds to a direct to tenant option, really kind of helped with ensuring households could be served, dollars can get out the door, and to really allow people to feel like the city was being responsive and to kind of develop buy-in with the program.
I'll also just add, I think that everything that both Claudia and Vincent said are extremely important. I think that one other thing I'll add is that anecdotally, we've heard that there needs to, that program administrators have also just generally become more flexible in the way they receive things and receive documentation, to be a little more specific. And I think that, a lot of places had applications that were available only through a computer web browser, and making sure that applications are accessible in a multitude of forms is really important, because not everybody has a computer, not everybody will have a computer with internet access. Finding other ways and opening up more pathways for people who are higher need, who may not have all of these assets available at the tips of their fingers. Yeah, thank you.
And then another question here. Have any of you seen any stipulations? I think this is referring to a requirement of a landlord. Yeah, obviously. Are there any stipulations that you have seen about landlords not reporting late rent or anything that would negatively impact credit ratings in order to participate in the rental assistance program?
So I think there's large variation in what was asked for owners, and some asked essentially withdrew all kind of requirements on owners. The most common, as Claudia said before, was evictions. And so, I think in an ideal world, data is linked more actively, and also municipalities were able to know some of these realities, but I'd venture to say, and I could be wrong, and Andrew, actually, this is where you're the moderator, but I actually encourage you to answer questions as well, because you'd be very much an expert on this topic, right? Is that for a large share of municipalities, there were very few that asked that of landlords, right? And so that could be affecting some of the response there.
I gotta check the time here. So we have a couple of minutes yet left here. I'm gonna ask, since you're researchers, I'm gonna ask a research-oriented questions that came up. And this person says, I'm curious whether you evaluated the ratio between the available benefit, so the rent that would be available, to the fair market rent or other type of indicator of housing costs in a particular jurisdiction.
Oh, that's a very good question. I'm going to put that on our list of next things to analyze, because that's great. And I don't think the amount of assistance always lined up very well with FMR. In fact, we definitely saw programs that had challenges because there was a big discrepancy there, and because they didn't allow landlords to charge the difference. So definitely a question worth pursuing. Thank you so much.
And on our landlord survey, I would say though, so one, we collect those data. So yes, it's always nice. Please ask more questions like that so we can add that on our list of things to do with our data. But on our landlord survey, there was a lot of landlords who said that they preferred if rental assistance programs were structured as a share of the rent amount, right? Rather than a fixed dollar amount, which often didn't necessarily, as this question suggests, could be too high or too low. That share seemed more palatable to at least owners in the surveys that we've done.
So we're about out of time. So I'm going to ask one more question that I think is an interesting question. So looking forward, what lasting changes in rental assistance operating policies and procedures do you anticipate will come out of this experience that we're all having right now?
Well, I do think to the previous question, building in that extra flexibility, the first round of programs that we saw often did things like, set an amount that all households would receive. And it was just a set amount. Maybe it was a one-time payment. I think going forward, programs will try to be more flexible to meet the needs of individual tenants and landlords. And I hope that's the case, especially since we're seeing with our tenant surveys that there's such a huge variation in the debt that households have accrued at this point. I do also hope that building in flexibility to adapt to changes will be part of this. I know Vincent mentioned that in response to issues of landlord cooperation, we saw some programs do innovative things, like have a direct-to-tenant option, for example. So I think building in that flexibility on the front end as well will be so important going forward. And who knows how the context for this assistance will continue to change. Who knows whether the CDC eviction moratorium will still be in place. If it's not, that will totally change the landscape for how willing landlords are to engage with these programs and the level of demand for programs just to prevent that wave of evictions that we see down the road. So flexibility is the name of the game for me.
Rebecca, do you want to go next? Or...
You can go first, Vincent.
Okay. So I think there are several things, right? Clearly, I think a lot has been learned on outreach, right? We all know that many of our housing assistance programs, aside from being oversubscribed, often don't serve all households evenly, right? And so I think what we've seen is a lot of innovation around outreach strategies during the pandemic that hopefully then apply hereafter, right? I also think that the pandemic has presented opportunities for collaborations across agencies with monies flowing a different way, need for capacity and support, whether we like it or not, right? We all talk about crossing silos, but then we all go back into our silos. And I have to hope in a moment like this, where programs are being developed cross-agency in really interesting and new ways, that actually speaks to some of that. I think there's capacity being built at the local level, right? These are local rent relief programs that largely did not exist before, right? This is a relatively new idea and concept. And part of that is a function of the constraint of funding, but also maybe in some places the constraint of the way we thought about providing housing assistance and who does, right? We've been waiting for housing vouchers to become universal for some time, and it hasn't quite yet happened. Maybe it will, fingers crossed, right? But all to say is I think there's innovation happening at the local level, and maybe the adoption of these programs. And the last bit I would say is just the flexibility. The landlord-based model for providing assistance works in many contexts, but doesn't work in every context, right? So what we have here is people really innovating and thinking creatively about different ways of forming housing assistance, and also thinking of it in a broad set of spectrums, right? Not just housing assistance, but eviction diversion programs, all of these other kind of things, and being forced to kind of think flexibly about how we provide assistance, who we provide it to, and the continuum that it sits within.
And I feel like, to pick off of a point that Vincent mentioned, I think that what I am thinking and hoping is that this moment will show how important housing is. I think it already has, and I hope it will continue to do so, and that we can eventually, I mean, that we can eventually get to, universal housing vouchers. But also, I think just more broadly, there are so many lessons learned here that can help programs run more effectively and efficiently. And I think that with the new $25 billion Treasury Emergency Rental Assistance Program, we will continue to learn so much more about how rental assistance can operate at the state level, how it can operate in smaller communities, how it can operate in big cities. And I think that this is an incredible learning opportunity to use for eventually when there is more housing assistance more broadly.
Well, thank you. So it's 3 o'clock, so we're out of time, but I just want to mention, do we have a last slide with our contact information on it and links? So again, I mentioned this at the beginning, so this has been recorded and we will post this recording and these slides online. And if you want to reach out to any of us, I mean, you're more than welcome to reach out to us with any additional questions. And also on the second to last slide that you just saw is a link to all of the research reports that we have done so far, as well as our emergency rental assistance database. And again, I just want to thank all of you for joining us, and check out our report that we published today, and also the reports from Housing Initiative Partnership and those from NYU Furman Center. And we'll have more information about our findings as we move forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.